here we are in the Wadi Faynan, which is a very special place for human history. It's got a very, very long sequence of occupation. People have been here since at least 500,000 years ago. We've found the hand axes that these early Stone Age people used to make lying around the landscape, many, many of them. So people were obviously here in large numbers. And they were coming out of Africa at that point, spreading into Europe and across the old world, bringing with them a very mobile hunting and gathering lifestyle. People continue to exploit this landscape in a similar way for a long, long time until you get to the point when hunting and gathering societies begin to become a little bit more sophisticated, a little bit more complex in the way they use the landscape, and start in locations like this, between the mountains and the plains, to sit down in one spot where they can exploit the different ecological zones around them, picking up different animals and plants in different seasons in these different areas. That's the start of the period when people begin to manipulate the landscape around them, begin to cultivate the wild plants, and begin to manage the wild herds of animals. And that's the very beginning of the process that we call the Neolithic, the period when people move from being mobile hunter-gatherers to settled farmers. It's a period of very major change, but it happens over a very, very long time. It happens over very many thousands of years. So, although it used to be referred to as a revolution, we try and avoid that term now because that implies something much more instant. But it is still an enormous period of transition. The lifestyle at the beginning of that period and the lifestyle at the end were enormously different. And there are within that process periods of much faster change and development. And here we can pick up, and we'll see at various stages, how people actually made conscious decisions. It's not just an accidental drift. People are making deliberate changes within that. They don't know where they're going in the terms of coming to modern society, but in their own way they're laying the little steps, step by step, that leads to society as it is today.
The Neolithic developed throughout the Levant. What makes Wadi Faynan a really special place, really archaeologically of prime importance, is that in this wadi we have a sequence of 3 Neolithic sites marking different phases of that development. We start with WF16, a pre-pottery Neolithic A site. That's when hunter-gatherers had begun settling down before they're making pottery as we're cultivating plants, between about 12,500 and 10,500 years ago. That's followed by a site called Ghwayr 1, which is a pre-pottery Neolithic B site, where they have much more substantial architecture, a more developed economy, and that dates from about 10,500 to 8,500 years ago. Eventually that's followed by the pottery Neolithic, and here we have the site of Tell Wadi Feinan. Those 3 sites are all found within 2 kilometres of each other. It makes this a unique Neolithic landscape in the whole of the Levant. Behind me is the knoll of WF16, the location of the pre-pottery Neolithic A site. It looks just like a knoll, bit of the geology of the landscape, but in fact the upper parts of it is a Neolithic tell. It's the compacted collapse of mud clay buildings that accumulated over several thousand years.
Steve and I found this site on the back of some survey I was doing for the Nature Reserve, the Baseline Cultural Heritage Survey. And in 1996 we came here looking for early prehistory. And we walked around the wadi hunting for different sites in very hot weather until finally one day we started walking up the knoll that you see behind us, where we found a whole series of flint artefacts, little flint blades, very fine pieces of well-crafted flint, and grinding stones, typical of the early Neolithic, with cup holes in them, where they used to use a pestle and mortar to work nuts and grain and so on. That gave us an indication that we had what at that point was incredibly rare, a very early Neolithic site in Jordan. There'd only been one found before in Jordan at that time, so this was a very interesting opportunity for us to come back and do more work. We came back and did several years' worth of evaluation, doing more survey in the area and digging a number of small trenches. And we found very interesting results. First of all was the architecture, where we had a range of different types of building. From the front of the knoll we had what we thought was the very earliest architecture, typical of what the previous hunter-gatherers had been living in, where there was a pit dug into the ground, roughly lined with boulders, but not a proper wall, and just a little bit of mud used to mortar the holes between the boulders. Then we found, above that, we found mud-built buildings made out of adobe or pisé, where the walls were made out of layers and layers of thick, very strong mud that dried almost like concrete. And then finally, the last phase on the site seems to be when they came out of these semi-subterranean buildings and started to build above ground with stone architecture, coursed stone, so that the walls were actually going up above ground level. So that was very interesting, seeing that sequence of architectural development. But we also had a whole range of artefacts that we found and various bits of economic evidence, particularly the animal bones, which showed that one of the specialities of the site was hunting wild goats, which was particularly interesting to us because that's one of the key animals at the beginning of the process of domestication.
When we opened the large trench in 2008, we immediately went down onto a complex array of walls built out of mud clay. These turned out to be the walls of a dense cluster of structures, mainly circular structures, that had been cut into the underlying gravel terrace, lined with pisé, this mud clay, and then had walls built up perhaps a metre, maybe 2 metres above the surface to make semi-subterranean structures. Then that had what we think were flat roofs on. There's a whole mix of these. Some very small ones that we know had been used as workshops because of the artefacts we found in them. Others we think were used for storage. Some probably as domestic dwellings for a range of plant processing, cooking activities. And others, one particular large one, was a very large communal structure. But there was one structure in particular that was important because it was well preserved, because sometime in prehistory it actually burnt down, which enabled much better preservation than any of the others.
And we're actually sitting on a replica of the roof of that structure because as it burnt down, it took down the whole roof with it and baked it hard, so we know how the roof was actually made, which is a very unusual feature to get on a Neolithic excavation. So you can see how it's made. It's basically made of mud, mixed with chaff from barley and some gravel and clay. And it's like concrete. These buildings are very solid, which is how they've been preserved for the last 12,000 years. The building that burnt down, very interesting building. It consists of a number of different phases, but the best and most interesting phase is one where it seems to be used as a storage chamber. There's a cell inside it, which is made of a fairly thin mud clay wrapped around what we think was some wicker work to make a little domed central container. And underneath that, there were a number of small divisions in the mud clay, so it was partitioned inside. Around that, inside the rest of the building, were a series of stones placed so that you could actually put wooden posts in between them, wooden beams in between them, and on that was a floor. So there was a floor lifted up above the ground, so you had a suspended floor. And we think the purpose of these things was for storage, so that you're containing it and you're lifting it up out of any soil moisture, away from any of the rodents and mice and things that are beginning to live with people. And the only reason we can really see for that is so that you're actually preserving the material and things that you're harvesting at the site.
That was a remarkable find, that structure. But possibly even more amazing was what we discovered at the far northern end of the settlement. When we had removed all the top deposits, we came down to a very large area of midden. Now, midden is a rubbish dump. It's archaeological gold dust. And it was within that we found a huge array of discarded animal bone fragments, the debris for making stone tools and beads, and so forth. That was brilliant. But as we excavated further down, we came onto a solid mud plaster fall below that. And when we removed all the midden, that turned out to be a huge structure, the largest we had ever seen in this part of the Levant, indeed one of the largest ever found in the Neolithic. This turned out to be a structure of about 20 metres in diameter. It was surrounded by benches, wide benches on which people could have sat or even laid or slept. And it seems to have been a structure not only built by a large corporation of probably several families, but probably for communal activities, because it almost looks like a small amphitheatre, and it's impossible to get away from the idea that this was for some sort of performance. Now, whether ritual or simply entertainment, whether it was about social rituals, were not clear. But it's a remarkable discovery at this site, showing that no doubt this was an area where people came from the surrounding landscape to aggregate here, probably at certain times of the year, for important rituals about maintaining the solidarity of the Neolithic wider community.
One of the possibilities is it's to do with harvesting, when they need to bring people together for the labour. And at one end of this elliptical building, on little platforms raised up inside the floor of the structure are two of the grinding stones. So we do wonder whether it's a place where you could almost have some sort of harvest festival, if that's not too fanciful an idea, where you're bringing together people for a harvest party, which brings you the labour force you need for this new activity and explains why you've got this construction. It's the only building we've got in this part of the Levant which is decorated. Preserved on the faces of the plaster walls are wavy lines of mud, forming a double wave pattern. And there are other features like bosses and so on. And it looks like it's replastered repeatedly, so they're probably redecorating it, perhaps even for each time they use it, by another thin coating of plaster on top.
One of the most fascinating aspects of the excavation were the human burials that we found on the site. Now, these had been cut into floors and walls of the structures. The dead had been placed into these in a crouched position, often in a sleeping position with a head on their hands. They were both of adults and children and some infants. We suspect a cross-section of the whole community that were there. Now, sometimes they've been placed into the burial and just left there as what we call a primary burial. In other cases, it seems that parts of the skeleton had been removed and placed elsewhere. So, for instance, we find some skeletons where we have multiple skulls there, or ones where there are no skulls at all, ones where there just parts of the torso left. So it seems there was the complex burial process, burial ritual, that probably went on for many years as the dead were moved from location to location. Some graves opened again and further bones put in, possibly of relations, and then closed again. And some of the skulls we found had been decorated with bands of black paint around the back of them. And in some cases, bones had been wrapped up in gypsum plaster bundles. Looks like they were then wrapped in some vegetable fibres because of the imprints on the fibre. So a complex burial process, ritual occurring at the site, showing that WF16 is not only a place of the living, it's also a place of the dead.
The burial practices start from the very beginning of the site, so we've got some below the floors of the earliest buildings. We've got real foundation burials where the heads were left, or the skulls were left sticking slightly through the floor to mark their positions so people could open them up later on. But the majority of the burials we've got are quite high in the site's history and reflect a layer of architecture that we've probably lost. It's probably eroded off the top of the knoll. And all we've got left is the burials and some of the groundstones, except for one building, one very large circular structure that was preserved because it was put partly inside the hollow where the amphitheatre structure used to be. And that's a very substantial building, and what's interesting about it is that it's actually no longer a semi-subterranean building, it's a freestanding building with the walls going above ground, the big change in architecture that happens towards the end of this Proto-Neolithic A period. Interestingly, the midden that we found covering the large structure, the large communal structure, probably relates to this final phase, and perhaps even to that building. It's where people have been throwing out vast quantities of animal bone, and also a large number of broken artefacts, objects, and art objects and tools and so on. And because we've got that midden, we've actually got a remarkable collection of objects which haven't been found at many other PPNA sites, including a lot of the broken bits of decorated items, figurines and so on.
One element of the animal fauna I find particularly fascinating are the bird bones. Wadi Faynan is a wonderful place for bird watching, and particularly striking the raptors, the eagles and the vultures we see. When we excavated WF16, we found a huge number of bird bones there. In one structure, the one on which this reconstruction is based, we found a horizon where there must have been 8 or 9 complete skeletons of what we think were buzzards. Now, what we think is that they had either been full stuffed birds, perhaps, that had been around on the walls, or maybe hanging from the roof of the house there, showing that the relationships with the animals and plants were not only of an economic nature, but of a social and symbolic nature as well.
What's really interesting are the goat bone remains, because what we've been discovering with that, working with a colleague, is that the pattern of animals that's killed does not represent what you would get if you were just killing the animals at random, or even following typical hunting patterns. They seem to be trying to cull the animals in a particular way, so that they're killing particular age groups and particular sexes of animals to control the structure of the herd. It's not quite the same pattern as you get later on when people are moving into a sort of proto-domesticated form of herd structuring, but it shows that they're beginning to develop the skills to actually control the wild animal herds around them and their breeding patterns, so that they're controlling the overall herd structure for future years. It's beginning to look at the future of the wildlife around them, again helping stay in one place by manipulating the resources of the environment.
I suspect they're doing that because they invested so much in the site. Building these mud clay buildings is a huge task of labour, of resources, huge quantities of water being required. Having invested all that time in building here, they probably want to stay the longer periods during any one year and keep coming back. The wild resources by themselves would not have allowed that to be sustained, so they had to start managing the environment by the cultivation, by weeding and watering and replanting wild barley, and by beginning to herd the animals in the way that Bill was describing. It shows suddenly a change of attitude to the landscape and the environment around them, which is a key element in the start of the whole Neolithization process. We've got here a small range of the artefacts that have been recovered from WF16. So these all date to between 11 and 12,000 years ago. It is a pre-pottery Neolithic site, so the vessels are being primarily made out of stone, sometimes out of wickerwork and then covered with bitumen, and quite often they're decorated. You can see here you've got a beautiful wavy line there with these bosses underneath, mimicking what we find in the architecture of the large communal structure. And I find these particularly fascinating, these stone plaques with these various geometric images on, wavy lines, straight lines. No representation as far as I can see, but I'm sure they're charged of symbolic meaning. What do you think about those, Bill?
Well, I think this one's particularly interesting, where you've got the combination of the wavy line and the straight lines, because that's a symbol that's found on various sites up and down the Jordan Valley, and it looks like it's one of the things that unites these people together regionally. The artefact that's the classic one of the PPNA is this tiny little arrowhead with its two little notches on either side, and these are the typical things that we find on all the early PPNA sites, and it is, if you like, the type find of these sites.
They're called Elkine points.
Elkine points after the first site they were found at.
They weren't necessarily arrowheads. They might have been.
No,
we've
done some microscopic examination of the patterns of use that have been built up on them, and it looks like some of them being used for drilling. So possibly, indeed, for making these things, because these are the stone beads made out of the local copper ore. That's why we get this green colour, and it's the first, in a sense, use of copper in the region that goes on to become so famous for copper mining. But they're just using the raw copper ore, and some of these things are really quite big, and you can see how they're made. You can actually see the drilled hole going down through them. And we had on the site one little building that seems to be in a workshop, and on the floor of that, if you remember, there was a flat stone with little indentations, so it was like a work bench, so you could actually put your stone in it to hold it like a vice, and then drill out the centre of them. So that was a real workshop.
They're working lots of other types of materials as well. We've got many pieces of bone, which have either been clearly made into functional artefacts, such as this tiny, I'm not going to pick it up, this tiny little bone needle here. And that reminds us that we're only seeing a tiny fraction of the materials they're working, because they must have been working hide, leather, wide range of plant materials, making different fabrics from them, none of which has survived. Some of the bone objects, however, are decorated, suggesting again they're full of symbolic meaning. So this highly polished bit of rib bone, polished and burnished, and then it's got these tiny little drill holes in, but clearly forming some form of geometric pattern.
The needle's very good, because the fact that it's a proper needle with a hole in it for putting thread through shows that they're working soft materials as well. Yeah. It's this period, I think people forget, the image of prehistory is people wearing old thick leather hide and all the rest of it. This shows that they're probably wearing quite sophisticated materials. This is actually one of my favourites, this little basalt cup. And what we don't know if it's a cup, or it might even be a small mortar for grinding fine things like pigments or even makeup, perhaps, or scented materials. But that's a lovely worked piece of basalt. That.
Yeah, and most of the raw materials are local. So the malachite is coming from the surrounding geology, as is this stone. But many of the shells, and they're using shells to make beads, such as these tiny, beautiful little examples here. These would have been coming from the coast, either both the Mediterranean coast and the Red Sea coast. Now, whether they derive from people going and collecting them from here, or whether they arrived here by trade or as gifts from visitors, we don't know. But clearly, with all this vast array of material culture, it suggests that this is a bit of a melting pot for ideas about craft skills, and where there's a lot of innovation happening, especially I think on working the malachite. So exciting to see that. Standing on the pre-pottery Neolithic A site of WF16, I can look east up towards Jourdain Plateau, and just 500 metres away is the pre-pottery Neolithic site of Ghwayr 1. And then I can turn and look west out towards the plain, and just 2 kilometres away is the pottery Neolithic site of Tell Wadi Feinan. We're looking at the pre-pottery Neolithic B site of Ghwayr 1 that follows WF16 in the Neolithic sequence. To learn more about the site, we met up with Dr. Mohammad Najjar, who excavated this settlement in the 1990s.
So we are sitting now at the steps of one of the streets of Ghwayr 1, which is pre-pottery Neolithic site, dated back to around 9,000 years ago, let's say, because it has great architecture, very good preservation. We have these dense architecture here. The walls and the floors were plastered. Probably we have some indication that even the walls were plastered from the outside and painted red from the outside also. That will make it very beautiful village here in this wadi. Probably people choose this site to control the entryway to Wadi Faynan itself. And we were able to identify 3 architectural phases reflecting different social organization modification of the site during the 500 years where people were living here. So we have evidence for private ownership coming at least from the houses where we have private storage pits to store things in. The bone materials, animal bone stored using the goats, sheep and goats and so on. People were already cultivating land. They were farming already, but they still do the hunting. So most interesting finds here were some stone and clay figurines, and we have some arrowheads, those known as Byblos and Jericho arrowheads. These are typical for the pre-pottery Neolithic period. Okay, from here, let's go to follow the Neolithic sequence and visit Tell Wadi Feinan. This is Tell Wadi Feinan, named after the wadi running from Tell Feinan down towards Wadi Araba. The site was dated to the pottery Neolithic, which is around 7,000 years ago. During this period, we had big houses, stone houses. Usually they are built of stones. The stones are brought from the wadi bed itself, and these rocks were brought from up the Jordanian plateau. So they've been using these building materials. Usually we have big houses, and we have, of course, some channels and so on. What is interesting about this site is at the upper levels of the site we found kind of plateau or courtyard which was dated by C14 dating to the Chalcolithic period. So we have the pottery Neolithic at the bottom, and then we have the Chalcolithic period at the top, and that makes the site is even more interesting. It is rather flat here around us because this area has been used as field during the Roman period, so they flattened the top of the Tell. We call it Tell, and Tell is an artificial mountain, so we still call it Tell, although it is very flat. If you look at it from the Wadi, if you look at the section from the other side, you will see that it's going higher, so it was real Tell. From the earlier sites we have the concentration. It's very dense architecture there, so it's here more spacey here, and probably that's the reflection of moving from farming to herding goats.
We've gone from Wadi Faynan 16, the earliest Neolithic site in the Wadi, where people are living in semi-subterranean houses lined with mud, on to the site of Ghwayr 1, the PPNB site, where people have started to live above ground in stone-built houses, and finally to Tell Wadi Feinan, where they're making pottery and properly farming.
That is the story of the Neolithic. It's a story that's happening throughout the Levant that lays the foundations for the earliest civilizations. Here in Wadi Faynan, one can trace that process on the ground, walk through 6,000 years of prehistory, and it's fitting that one finishes at Tell Wadi Feinan, because there, in its upper layers, one finds the earliest traces of copper working. And Wadi Faynan, over the next few thousand years, would become a centre of copper working and bronze metallurgy for the ancient world. And that indeed is the next phase of the story of Wadi Faynan.